Philosophy is an odd thing. When we use the word in everyday speech, you sometimes hear it hilariously. They say, it's never good to be late. That's my philosophy." You think that's a generous ascription of that rather dull precept to call it a philosophy. But it's odd how philosophers, generally speaking, at least the ones I've read or the ones I value, don't have, in that sense, a philosophy. There is no particular Socratic or Nietzschean or Kantian way to live your life. They don't offer ethical codes and standards by which to live your life. They don't offer a philosophy to follow. They just simply raise an enormous number of questions, mostly. So in the sense that you put the question, is there a philosopher that's important to me? Well, I loved really the sort of Bertrand Russell grand sort of tour of philosophy, the history of philosophy from the pre-Socratics, as they're called, Zeno and so on, through to Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. I never quite liked Aristotle. I think that's partly, although he was obviously a genius and a brilliant, and he invented logic, so what's not to like? I think it was his influence on the medieval mind was probably rather pernicious and unfortunate, and all those categories and things. But when it opened up with, I suppose, Spinoza but then Kant really in the Enlightenment era. Oh, and actually Locke, I did like Locke. He was a fine philosopher. But they don't, I mean, what's so great about them is that they just, they're quite scary when you think of the word philosopher, and especially if it's logic and symbolic logic, and you get onto Hegelian philosophy. It's incredibly difficult to read, I find, and you follow for about, it's like trying to grab a salmon, the harder you clutch at it, the more it slips out of your hand, and whoa, it's gone, and you chase it again, and what was that? And you feel very stupid. But I think the beauty of questioning and simplicity that you get from Kant in particular, I think, is just amazing, because it's like they say of simple mathematical laws, that make fractals. The tiniest little elegant observation about or question about something just spins out these immensely complex things that make you rethink everything. So yes, I think philosophy is a really important dimension, but I think in our age we tend to be rather sloppy about it. We either think Buddhism is philosophy, which or some sort of Eastern thing about being nice and spiritual, and that'll do, which is fine. I mean, obviously I believe in kindness and niceness and lots of spiritual things, but the real intellectual rigor and quest of logic is something that I'm afraid takes incredibly hard work, and we live in an age in which hard work is, if not actively deprecated or denigrated, it is run away from or ignored. It's sort of, people frown at you and say, well, that's a bit dull and stupid. Why can't we just short-circuit it and talk about, like, spirit? Well, yeah, you can say spirit, but if you think that's philosophy, and if you think that's good enough, the most important philosophy, I think, is that even if it isn't true, you must absolutely assume there is no afterlife. You cannot for 1 second, I think, abrogate the responsibility of believing that this is it. Because if you think you're going to have an eternity in which you can talk to Mozart and Schopenhauer on a cloud and learn stuff and really get to grips with knowledge and understanding, and so you won't bother now, I think it's a terrible mistake. It may be that there is an afterlife and I'll look incredibly stupid, but at least I will have had a crammed pre-afterlife, a crammed life. So to me, the most important thing is, as Kipling put it, to fill every 60 seconds to fill every unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, absolutely. So that's all I'm saying, I suppose, is that there's no point wasting time being lazy. Though, of course, indolence in a divine way, axidy, has its advantages. Oh, shut up, Steve. Okay, next one. It's interesting. Atheism comes in for rather a bad press, and I suppose I'd rather describe myself as a humanist. I don't believe in God. I don't believe there is a God. If I were to believe in a God, I would believe in gods. I think monotheism is the really ghastly thing. That is the absolutely staggering, to me, misapprehension. I can perfectly see why anybody might imagine that each thing that grows, each phenomenon that accompanies us on our journey through life, the sky, the mountains, spirits of nature. I can imagine why man would wish to endow them with an inner something, an inner animus that they would call the god of that thing. I can see that. It's a beautiful and charming way of looking at it, and I can understand the Greek idea that there are these principles of lightning or of war or of wisdom, and that to embody them, to personify them into Athena or Ares or whichever god you want makes enormous sense. But to say that there is one only God who made it all and who is, that is just, what? Why? Who said? Where? Come on. And I love how when people watch, I don't know, a David Attenborough or a Discovery Planet type thing, where you see the absolute phenomenal majesty and complexity and bewildering beauty of nature, and you stare at it, and somebody next to you goes, and how can you say there's no God? Look at that. And then 5 minutes later, you're looking at the life cycle of a parasitic worm whose job is to bury itself in the eyeball of a little lamb and eat the eyeball from inside while the lamb dies in horrible agony. And then you turn to them and say, yeah, where's your God now? I mean, you can't just say there's a God because the world is beautiful. You have to account for bone cancer in children. You have to account for the fact that almost all animals in the wild live under stress with not enough to eat and will die violent and bloody deaths. There is not any way that you can just choose the nice bits and say that means there is a God and ignore the true fact of what nature is. The wonder of nature must be taken in its totality. And it is a wonderful thing. It is absolutely marvelous. And the idea that an atheist or a humanist, if you want to put it that way, doesn't marvel and wonder at reality, at the way things are, is nonsensical. The point is we wonder all the way. We don't just stop and say, that which I cannot understand I will call God, which is what mankind has done historically. That's to say, God was absolutely everything 1,000 or 2,000 years ago because we understood almost nothing about the natural world. So it could all be God. And then as we understood more, God receded and receded and receded. So suddenly now he's barely anywhere. He's just in those things we don't understand, which are important. But I think it just is such an insult to humanity. And the Greeks got it right. The Greeks understood perfectly that if there were divine beings, they are capricious, unkind, malicious mostly, temperamental, envious, and mostly deeply unpleasant. Because that you can say, well, yes, all right, if there's going to be God or gods, then you have to admit that they're at the very least capricious. They're certainly not consistent. They're certainly not all-loving. I mean, really, it's just not good enough, is it? If we empower ourselves with responsibility over our actions, responsibility over our destinies, and responsibility for directing and maintaining and creating our own ethical and moral frameworks, which is the most important thing, really, isn't it? Because perhaps the greatest insult to humanism is this idea that mankind needs a God in order to have a moral framework. There's a very clear way of demonstrating logically how absurd that is, because the warrant for that logical framework, for that moral framework that comes from God, is always tested against man's own morals. It's a complicated argument, but I mean it's the standard one, which is pretty unanswerable. But the idea that we don't know right from wrong, but we have to take it from words put down in a book 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,000 years ago and dictated to rather hot-headed, neurotic desert tribes, is just insulting. It's just no. I mean, if there were a God, he would want us to be better spirited than to take his word for everything. Wouldn't he? If he gave us free will, would he really want us to say, no, I have to abide by everything that's written in this book? all the laws of circumcision and of eating and what to do with menstruating women. I'm going to obey those written down there. I won't think for myself because that's not required of me. Come on. It's just not good enough. And you know, I have no quarrel with individuals who are devout and who have faith. I don't want to mock them. I really don't. But damned if I'm going to be told by them what to do with my body, or damned if I'm going to have the extraordinary battles won by enlightenment over the past 400 years, to have those battles abnegated by a new dark ages. The battle lines must be drawn. Music in its time, but I mean that's a function of history. You know, the fact is that the composers always write for power, or power and money, and it so happened that in the period when polyphony all the way through to the classical and early romantic era, all the power and the money was with the church. So some great masses and some great choral music and some great oratorios were written, from obviously the Baroque age being the sort of pinnacle of that, but all the way through to the Mozart's final works, his Requiem and Beethoven's Missa Solemnis, and Mendelssohn and so on. There have been some marvelous religious works, and in painting similarly. But that's because these were princes. They were princes of the church. They were prince archbishops who employed Mozart. These were not spiritual beings who inculcated these composers with the sense of the divine that makes the music divine. The glory of Verdi's Requiem or Mozart's Requiem or Bach's pieces is that they are fantastically, incredibly human. And like all great human things, they reach for the infinite. They reach for beauty. A religious person would call that the divine. You could call it the numinous, you could call it anything else, but certainly that religion has been good for that and good for architecture, because it has required enormous buildings for the shepherding of people in order to do the services, and they spend a lot of money on it, and so they're rather glorious buildings. You've got to hand them that. Did they make the trains run on time? No, they didn't do that. That's about it, really. No, and there are some kind individual people. I mean, very kind people who give to the poor and look after the sick and so on. But it's not necessary and sufficient as a justification for religion, because there are plenty of people who are not religious who are also kind to the sick and good to the poor and care about people's well-being. Yes, oh, very much so. I mean, Trevor Huddleston and Archbishop Tutu from South Africa are two good examples who were both genuine men of their church, or obviously Huddleston is dead, but Tutu's still alive, and who both fought a terrible injustice and used all the authority of their position amongst their believers, but very bravely spoke out, sometimes against the wishes of the church hierarchies. Some liberation theologians who've some of them mad communists, some of them just decent liberals who fought against the hideous doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church, for example. And there are individual voices who are raised in conscience against the bureaucracy and the dogma and the doctrine of the churches. And, certainly, of course, individuals Bonhoeffer, for example, in Germany, the Lutheran minister who spoke out against Hitler. Of course, there have been good and fine religious people, and the Dalai Lama seems rather charming. I don't know. It's terrible. I don't want to come over as some terrible anti-ecclesiastical figure, but